Gilded Age.
During the last quarter of the 19th century, the nation's economy was booming, primarily as a result of industrialization. From 1865 to 1890, more land was settled in the West than during the previous 250 years of American history.
This growth had a dark underbelly. After the Civil War and Reconstruction, we saw the emergence of the Gilded Age, a term first coined by Mark Twain to describe the period from post-Reconstruction era to 1900.
Twain first referenced the term with fellow writer Charles Dudley Warner in their 1873 book, The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. Twain meant that in the era of post-Reconstruction growth, everything was glittering on the surface, but corrupt underneath.
During the 1800s, government regulation of business and industry barely existed. The notion that government needed to or had a right to curb the excesses of big business hadn't taken hold of the country yet.
By the late 1800s, these policies continued in what would be known as laissez-faire regulations. Laissez-faire regulations referred to a hands-off approach by government to business. It was believed that letting businesses grow uncontrolled would bring greater prosperity.
The result was that several businessmen grew to be titans in their industries and sometimes used their money and power to exploit the public. For example, during the building of the Transatlantic Railroad, many railroad companies bribed local politicians for property rights and gave money to members of Congress in exchange for inflated construction contracts.
Companies like John D. Rockefeller Standard Oil grew into monopolies. By 1879, Standard Oil controlled over 90% of the nation's oil refining capacity. These monopolists formed trusts that allowed them to escape anti-monopoly regulation. The result is that they use their power to prevent competition and keep prices artificially high, earning these titans the derisive title robber barons.
Class resentment built up as factory workers saw little of the riches of the factory owners trickle down to them. The Gilded Age presidents were weak regulators and reformers, so social change would have to come from a different source. Frustrated with low wages and poor working conditions, disgruntled workers began forming unions.
There were almost 10,000 strikes and lockouts in the 1880s. The social unrest caused many Americans to fear unions, and police and state troops were often used to break up strikes or larger labor meetings. After a national railroad strike during the Depression of 1890 to 1894 was broken by federal and state troops, the labor movement retreated into its shell.
The labor unrest was just one sign of trouble underlying the Gilded Age. Political corruption during this time was rampant. Many government officials took part in the spoils system, appointing supporters and friends to government office. After President Garfield was assassinated by a rejected office seeker in 1881, Congress thought, maybe the spoils system has gone too far.
So, Congress passed the Pendleton Civil Service Reform Act in 1883, curtailing the spoils system at the federal level. It converted some federal jobs to the merit system and gave presidents the option to convert more in the future, which many of them did.
On the state and city level, some governments were run by political machines. Unofficial organizations intent on keeping a certain group or party in power. Machines were usually headed by a corrupt individual or boss.
A prime example is William Marcy Tweed, appropriately nicknamed Boss Tweed. Tweed controlled Tammany Hall, the Democratic political machine that ran New York politics. Tweed and his cohorts used bribery and political favors to steal public funds and unofficially run the state legislature. He was finally convicted in 1872, but his influence stayed for years.
In addition to monopolies, political corruption, and dangerous working conditions, overcrowded cities and unmonitored factories led to concerns about sanitation. While the United States grew in population and prosperity during the Gilded Age, it became clear some of the excesses of the age needed to be curbed.